I'd like to look at chronic fatigue syndrome, long COVID, and other psychogenic, psychosomatic chronic illnesses called mind-body conditions, which of course they um, are all based in essentially an understanding of Jung. And his work was foundational, pretty much, whether knowingly or not, to all the other modalities that people are much more familiar with now in the mind-body space. So particularly looking at chronic fatigue syndrome and long COVID, perhaps, most but all the most Luddites would agree that it is not simply a biomedical condition, nor is it simply psychosomatic, but as we shall consider here, a deeply meaningful psychic expression. And by looking through the lens of psychological foundations laid by Jung and to some extent earlier, Freud, Galen, Hippocrates, who noticed that disturbances such as grief and fear would cause dysfunction, particularly in relation to heart and digestion, and countless others since. This understanding that proposed that when experience cannot be expressed or integrated consciously, it will most often find its voice through the body. And Freud, in his early work with hysteria, observed that repressed emotional material, especially that related to traumatic events, could become converted into physical symptoms, and thus the earlier word conversion disorder was coined for what we now consider to be mind, body, and psychosomatic, and then through to psychogenic neurocircuit conditions, functional neurological disorders, etc. His work on conversion disorders laid the groundwork for what we now understand as psychosomatic illness. He said, "The symptoms are the patient's own attempt at healing and a way of bringing subconscious messages to the surface." And these psychogenic, psychosomatic iterations have been recorded since the dawn of time. Jung expanded on Freud's insights here and introduced a dynamic model of the psyche where life energy, libido, not to be confused with the sexual energy that possibly more people confuse it with, but the very will to live, the very energetic essence of what it is to live, that which is guiding us as a life force. His idea was that the psyche, the life force, the energy, seeks expression always. And if it is blocked or repressed, it will appear elsewhere in the system, often in the form of symptoms, dreams, or creative output. And he coined the term principle of equivalence, which effectively explains this dynamic, and it forms the basis of what I'm talking about here, and is really, really key to my understanding of chronic fatigue syndrome. It's a foundational idea in his theory of psychic energy, and it's adapted from the first law of thermodynamics that states that energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed. And this is absolutely key for understanding what is going on with this rash and increasing epidemic of mind-body conditions, in my opinion. So this for Jung meant that whenever energy is withdrawn from one psychological activity, it will reappear elsewhere in the psyche. For example, if someone represses a desire or an emotion, for example, anger or sexual attraction, the psychic energy behind it does not vanish, but it reappears in another form, like as anxiety, or as a dream, a symbol, or an impulse, a coping mechanism, a process somewhere else in the system. And the psyche is redirecting the energy towards a different outlet, usually unconsciously, completely below the awareness of the individual. And the key implication being in this is that the psyche and psychic balance is dynamic. It's an energy flowing naturally between opposites, the unconscious and consciousness, the persona and shadow, and that there's this equilibrium that is always by nature seeking to be maintained, a homeostatic set point, if you like, at a greater or lesser degree, constantly thrown through this whole understanding of nature, which is being applied here with Jung. And if we repress things, that repression doesn't eliminate energy, it simply displaces it. And this is the key here. So neurosis, psychological iterations of distress, disorder, is caused by its physiological symptoms arise when energy is blocked or misdirected. And this supports his broader view that health is dependent on psychic energy, psychological energy. Don't get it confused with psychic, mediums, etc. But psychological energy, which is being allowed to move and find conscious expression, ideally in a balanced and individuated way. Freud saw repression it is about a repression and trauma, and Jung emphasized more of the symbolic energetic balance, but both were on a similar wicket here, because what's more, the Jungian perspective takes it a step forward, and it continues to shape what we now understand as modern therapeutic frameworks, whether explicitly or implicitly. And here I would include the work of Peter Levine, the AEDP model of Diane Fosher, IFS, internal family systems of Richard Swartz, coherence therapy, and even that of John Sarno's mind-body model. And all of these modalities rest, knowingly or not, on the idea that the psyche organizes symptoms to protect itself that are generated by energy that has been trapped by trauma, repression, or dissociation, and that they need to be released, transformed, and integrated for balance and wellness to be restored to the system. So if we start with Jung's principle of equivalence, in his psychological types and symbols of transformation, he introduces this principle of equivalence. He says, energy that is not expressed in one form will not disappear, but will manifest in another form with equal intensity, which for people who understand the more modern system of, say, Sarno, for example, he would call it the symptom imperative. And it's a symptom drift. It's a representation of the same energetic charge, but in a different part of the physiology or the psychology of the individual, if it has not been completed and dealt with. So it posits that if the emotional or instinctual energy that's repressed, so grief, rage, fear, longing, that energy, if it's not extinguished by being completed, if it's interrupted in some way, it becomes converted into something else outside of one's conscious awareness. If it cannot move through symbolic expression, through fantasies or daydreams or whatever other outlets it might be, dreams, or emotional processing, it may emerge as symptoms: fatigue, anxiety, chronic illness, emotional numbness, autoimmune conditions. He said, the psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. That is to say, that when the individual remains undivided and does not become conscious of his inner opposite, the world must perforce act out the conflict and be torn into opposing halves. So, due to this conflict between our conscious identity, the identifying ego, with identifying with social norms and expectations, the false self, the persona, who it's had to construct, being at odds and having to create a split in order to protect our true nature, the ego has dissociated from parts that of the self it deems dangerous and shameful. And these, of course, we understand would go into the shadow. These become buried, repressed, disowned parts, not available to view, but still operating from behind a curtain. And this split causes neurosis. Jung would say neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. So our understanding of the iterations of physical suffering that clients and individuals are experiencing is exactly this, a substitute for the legitimate suffering that they were not at some point able to experience in an authentic way earlier in their history. And so within the context of CFS, although it obviously applies to all mind-body conditions, what is the energy being held back here? Because this energy has been diverted to hold back something in the shadow. Where is it going? And what would happen if that energy were allowed to return? Freud's insight was that what the mind cannot bear, the body speaks. To briefly acknowledge his work in his early psychoanalytic career is to show that he understood that the unconscious can communicate with the body, that the system is holistic, it's dynamic, and it's a feedback loop, constantly going. Psyche, soma, soma, psyche. And when the verbal or emotional processing is not too threatening, this all works perfectly well. But in hysteria, conversion symptoms, he understood that these were symbolic expressions of unresolved emotional conflict, which would fit incredibly well with what we understand now, of course. And what he saw as mere repression, Jung broadened the spectrum a bit more, and he saw symptoms not merely as failures of integrating old unprocessed traumas, but as a purposeful message, a teleological message from the psyche attempting to restore balance within the whole system of the ego self axis. So critically, what they did was mark a turning point from seeing these conditions, whether they called it, looking at as neurosis, conversion disorder, whatever it might be, to not see it as pathology, but to see it as meaningful, and to understand that the body ultimately doesn't make mistakes. It's always, if we listen, giving us signals and helping us attain wholeness, authenticity, safety, and balance. Peter Levine, one of the founders of somatic therapeutic approaches to these conditions, offers a complementary view rooted in neurobiology. So he observed that trauma is not just psychological, but is somatic also in nature, so is physiological. So when the body is overwhelmed and unable to complete its natural defense responses of fight or flight, it will default to freeze. And if that freeze response itself isn't resolved, the nervous system stayed locked into a shutdown state. So this explains why in CFS we see profound fatigue, brain fog, loss of vitality, and emotional flatness. And in Levine's terms, the nervous system is stuck by energy that should have been mobilized for survival and escape, is instead being used to lock down and keep regressed these energies that are not allowed or have been forgotten to be completed and felt. So he would see this sort of lockdown equates to energy being diverted into repressing these energies in freeze because they haven't yet been able to complete, to be able to fulfill the cycle and come back to set point again. And Jung would call this regression. The energy has gone into regression to keep things in the shadow rather than progression to come back into the dynamic function of the whole system. So this somatic freeze mirrors Jung's psychic repression. Both describe systems where vital energy is bound, it's stuck, and it cannot circulate freely, whether it's psychological or physiological. And let's move on now to Diane Foscher, AEDP. She emphasized core effect, primary categorical emotions, in other words, and the transformative power of emotionally experiencing these in the context of relational safety. And she builds on trauma theory, but also aligns deeply with the Jungian model. And she shows that when trauma is not witnessed or processed, the body armors itself using inhibitory affects like guilt, shame, and numbness, which Jung would say is the ego effectively protecting us from these dangerous, disowned emotions and keeping them in that way. So she would relate that in saying that these secondary emotions of guilt, shame, and numbness have become a way to repress and keep this material at bay. And this maintains these defenses, and it's exhausting. It takes so much energy to repress, to keep at bay, hidden, to avoid at a subconscious level that which has not yet been able to be expressed to completion, that which has not been able to be felt or spoken or mentalized in any way. So this would apply to CFS and all mind-body conditions. And it can be viewed through the lens as a collapse of emotional vitality. This is the way it will appear. Suddenly, the vitality of the system has gone because it's been taken to deal with this unacceptable, unprocessed, unseen, forgotten, disowned material in the shadow, in the unconscious, and locked into the very cells of the body and the psychological systems of the mind. So for many of us, a system has spent sometimes decades or years suppressing and repressing emotions just to survive, because they have been deemed at some point so unacceptable to the world, to our own ego concept and ego construct, that they must be hidden from view. And she affirms, like Jung, that when the core affect is finally experienced, the grief, the anger, the longing, transformation and vitality will naturally emerge. So let's move on now to, say, modern parts work. And parts work is based really on this Jungian model, similarly with coherence therapy and that of John Sarno. So it's a continuation of this trajectory. IFS recognises that symptoms are created by protector parts, they'd call them, and these are parts of the ego that have been split off, trying to prevent deeper wounds being reactivated. And fatigue in this case often acts as a protective strategy. Similarly, coherence therapy helps the client uncover the emotional logic of the symptom. So, what hidden belief or implicit memory makes this fatigue or any other symptom necessary for me right now? For example, if I'm energetic, I may be expected to perform and I might be judged or harmed, something like that. And yet, if I collapse, I'll be left alone, and that's safer. So it's a protective mechanism. And once the unconscious truth is made conscious and it's allowed to be looked at and reevaluated, the symptom often resolves. John Sarno, in his work with chronic back pain and fatigue, echoed the same ideas. He believed that the body becomes effectively a canvas for unexpressed emotional energy, particularly with him, rage, anger. And his model would encourage clients to turn their attention inwards, to confront the defended emotional terrain, and allow blocked energy return to conscious circulation. So this would very much fit in with the progression that Jung talks about. So it's a reclaiming of the direction from having to repress into active progression, from regression to progression. If we now look at some of the latest approaches to this, pain reprocessing therapy, EAET, these are the theories of Alan Gordon and Howard Schubiner. These are a contemporary manifestation of the psychodynamic and somatic principles that Jung initially proposed. So pain reprocessing therapy teaches the brain to reinterpret chronic pain signals as safe. So it combines somatic tracking, this embodied awareness to allow and help express, to indicate safety to these hidden parts so that they can complete, cognitive reframing and emotional expression. And this is an attempt to rewire maladaptive neural pathways that have maintained the pain, fatigue, the back pain, whatever it might be. But it's all effectively the same thing. It's trying to release, identify, and reorganize these clusters of incomplete, buried, unnoticed, disallowed, disavowed, and forgotten aspects of survival instinct or of self, all of which are now speaking and are operating via projection onto us through our bodies and are speaking loud and clear. So emotional awareness and expression technique, that of Howard Schubiner, focuses on helping clients identify in exactly the same way and express avoided emotions, especially anger, sadness, and fear, these categorical emotions, these primary process emotions, which, let's be clear, are our very nature, our instinct, and the things that keep us alive and the things that organize and manage nervous system regulation. And these are effectively the causes of these chronic symptoms. And it's his process, again, is about looking at and allowing these repressed emotional truths to surface. Again, paralleling Jung and depth psychology's approach that healing arises not from controlling, from managing symptoms, but by listening to their messages. So, what is clear is that all these modalities rest at root in the foundations laid by Jung. Each of them, though they speak a more modern language, reiterate Jung's essential insight that what is repressed does not disappear, it returns. And that symptoms are not signs of pathology, but of integrated psychic energy that the body and psyche, mind, psyche, soma, are always conspiring not to destroy us. They're not conspiring against us, they are conspiring to keep us alive and to restore balance, often at the great displeasure of the ego, who thinks we should perhaps be someone else. It's the belief that healing is not suppression, or management, but integration. It's certainly not symptom management. And therefore, CFS is not an energy to be eliminated and a condition to be eliminated, but a signal, a symbol sent to the deeper self. Its purpose not for destruction, but for protection. And it will arise to safeguard the system when life either becomes unmanageable, when we have abandoned our true selves. And these two factors are becoming more and more apparent in modern life. Life is unmanageable, life is overwhelming. We have to do more than we have time for. We have to be more than we have time for. We have to commit ourselves to personas and self-concepts that have abandoned our true selves, our authenticity, our innate sense of who we are. And this is the cost. And we can do it for so long. We can do it to some extent, but we can't routinely do it to the point where we have tipped the balance so far that we have destabilized the system, so that that intelligent system will bring us back by a hearty, great big signal, which is chronic illness. And it's the abandonment of our true selves. It's the pushing that comes with having to be someone else that causes emotions to remain unspoken, where meaning becomes lost. And in doing so, it pulls us inward by default. When we get ill, we have to rest, we have to reflect, we have to retain and reclaim our authenticity and renewal. If we listen genuinely, if we have ears that can hear with courage to what is being said, CFS becomes more than a cluster of symptoms, more than the condition. It becomes the guide and a compass, a vital participant in the individuation process that is the unfolding of the true self, that Jung saw as the central task of human life. And to work with CFS from this perspective is not to fight against the body, but to enter into dialogue with the self. We do not override or fix the symptoms, we learn to translate them. We ask, what is being protected? What longs to be felt and heard? And what truth has been waiting in the dark for us to speak of or return to? So, that is, from my perspective, a confident understanding that all roads lead to Rome. And if we can see that there is an architecture, a map, an engineering, if you like, that applies parity to all these models based on Jung's principle of equivalence, we can have more confidence in understanding that it is by allowing, it is about making the unconscious conscious, about dealing with repressed material, about reclaiming authenticity and using our illnesses, our conditions, our symptoms as signposts back to the self and to the ultimate wellness, which is the thing we crave so much.